Greetings, comrades, and welcome to the Southwest is Red, the podcast in which we discuss the latest news about the Global South from a Latin American perspective with a Chinese twist. I'm one of your hosts, Nico.
And I'm your other host, Pedro. Well, these weeks were not a slow news period. In fact, lately, things seems to be speeding up. One of the main topics, I believe, it's the conflict between India and Pakistan that, well, it has been simmering for quite some time, and maybe, as most things that happen in international relations, right, the results can be quite unexpected.
It is difficult to underestimate the impact this would have. In a world already in crisis due to the genocide in Gaza and the war in Ukraine, both of which don't seem are going to end soon. The special characteristic of the conflict between India and Pakistan is that both of them have nuclear weapons, which takes the whole thing to another level.
Well, and not only that, I will have to hold my horses because you know this subject is my cup of tea. One of the most striking things for me, and of course, human lives matter, I am not saying that, but talking about a security analyst, it's the new combat experience we are getting from these recent events. The news are crazy, and as we know already, it takes some time to verify the facts. But so far, it seems that Pakistanis surprised everyone by shooting a Dassault Rafale, which is a 4.5 generation fighter.
No, please don't start with your specifications about aircraft again. Please.
No, I'm working on it. But I just need to say two things, okay? The first one Rafale costs about 160 million euros. It's one of the most expensive fighters of today. And for India, it was even more expensive because in April this year, last month, they signed a contract with France for purchasing 26 units for the Navy. Each one of these Navy Rafale of India costs 280 million.
Wow, that is quite the markup. That is why I always say, never trust the French. Never.
Well, maybe the Indians are agreeing with you now, and they're totally thinking that. And, well, the second thing I want to talk about, it's about the Pakistani Air Force. Let me remind you, my friend, that the backbone of the Pakistani Air Force is made from Chinese and Chinese-Pakistani fighters. And maybe it can be a free time activity, a pastime for our listeners. Go open your browser, search for defense contractors in both Europe and China, specifically Dassault and Avik Chandu, and see the stock market changes over the past weeks. I don't know how to put it, but it seems that, the vigorous dragon, it's indeed a vigorous dragon.
Yes, I'm totally checking this right now. Yes, for sure. I have to say, though, that luckily we have a war expert in this podcast, because myself, I could never absorb so much information so quickly. On a more diplomatic note, in the end, there was a ceasefire that was accepted by both sides, but I think it got different reactions from India and Pakistan. I know that at least on the Indian side, there is a certain anger in the right among some members of the BJP, the party in power, and that the opposition of the Indian National Congress also took the opportunity to criticize Modi, especially what they called his loss of control of the narrative. On the Pakistani side, it seems they were pretty happy. On other news, the European Union and China decided to restore relations on a parliament level, in a development that seems like a clear signal to Trump that his anti-China policies are not popular in the old world. However, we don't know which impact this measure will have besides the obvious symbolic one. Or maybe it would be better to say that any impact will take some time to have an effect. So we will have to see what happens.
Well, it's funny that you say that the Indians, they are not so happy because, well, the Pakistani, they are, at least the ones I know and the ones on the internet also, they are totally crazy about the scored victories. But my friend, sometimes I don't understand the Europeans. Because at the same time they're making this move you mentioned with China, reestablishing parliamentary level relations. One spokesperson of the European Commission said recently that China is contributing to Russia's war effort. And of course, I don't think they are dumb. The Europeans, I mean, they are dumb. They are quite aware of what the US is doing. And international relations is all about thinking well before choosing a side. At least that's the theory. So, I don't know, let's keep watching and analyzing. And I think we should comment the recent elections too. Romania, Canada, Australia, and in Germany. Of those, probably only Romania can be considered as a country of the global south. But I think, taken as a whole, they provided a good opportunity for us to talk about some similarities in world politics that can apply to both North and South. What do you think?
You are right, and these elections represent different cases too. For example, in Romania, a far right candidate won, and the sitting prime minister resigned from his position, leaving his country in political chaos. In Germany, the CDU candidate, Merz, to chancellor, failed to get enough votes in the first round, even though he had an alliance with the center left SPD that seemed to ensure that they would have enough. Luckily, at least for him, in a second round, everything was solved. And then we have the cases of Canada and Australia, in which the center right parties, that are wrongly called center left by the media, won against the more rightist opposition. In Canada, it was seen as a victory of liberalism against populism. And for me, one of the things that I would want to question right from the start is this opposition that is often made in media and in academia between populist parties and liberal parties. I don't know how you feel about the category of populism, but to me, it is just a confusing classification that obscures the real fault lines in contemporary politics.
Well, I agree. I agree with you. It's confusing, but one of the things that every time someone, especially when I was reading for today's recording, this thing with populism is that a lot of people use the term without being sure of its meaning. We can see this a lot in social media. We could say the same for liberalism, communism, I don't know, propaganda. Remember that nice discussion last class about definitions of propaganda? I know you do.
I have done a lot to forget that one, but yes, I think that in the case of populism, the issue is not so much that people use it without knowing its meaning or using it incorrectly, but that even the academic meaning of the word has many issues. If we look at liberalism or communism, okay, they are somewhat vague terms, and the common sense definition is maybe not so good, but at least they are used by communists or liberals to identify themselves. Populism, on the other hand, is used like a catch all for everything that is outside a very narrow definition of normal politics. And you also mentioned propaganda, but I think that's kind of a different case because it's more of a case of how there is a common sense definition of the word that's pejorative and a more technical definition in the context of how we communists use the word.
Well, okay, Hermano, I agree with you, but we would spend a long time if we started to specify everything, right? So, and I don't know, I'm not sure if you're going to agree with me on this one, but I do think that these terms, they are purposely being misused by mainstream media and some academic circles. Talking about Canada, would it be correct to call Poilievre, that guy, the populist guy, they say that it's populist guy, that loves Milton Friedman and he keeps repeating that the system is broke? Why would it be right to call him a populist? I don't know. I honestly see this populist label as an attempt to put the left and the right inside the same basket. You know that, see, both sides are evil. That kind of narrative.
For sure, I think that one of the things that gets me angry with this is this conflation between left and right populism. Also, the bastardization itself of the word, which to me, I always like to use it for the Russian Narodniks in Tsarist Russia, who were defenders of the propaganda of the deed and who did lots of work with the peasants. And this is like the real populism, not a billionaire being racist. And the other thing that bothers me too, as you say, is that it's a great equalizer, this category, because we are putting political phenomena in the global north and in the global south on the same level. We end up with a list that has some racist, misogynist, transphobic white guy that love cutting taxes for the rich with, I don't know, Lula or Evo Morales. And that doesn't seem right.
Exactly. Like, how in the world, like Lula, whatever, like they belong to the same category. It's not right. And hearing these types of ideas makes me want to, I don't know, to visit those journalists, scholars at their homes and have one or two words with them. But we still have an important question, right? Why these categories keep getting mixed? I think one possible answer lies in that idea of extreme center, right?
Basically, the idea of extreme center comes from, as you say, Tariq Ali, who used it as a way to explain why the two-party system in many countries, the US, UK, or Spain, for example, had turned into a virtual one-party system. This is a change that can be traced to the U-turn of Mitterrand or the third wave of Blair and Clinton, and it was the admission of the center left that, as Thatcher said, there is no alternative to neoliberalism. So in many of these countries, we see a turn to unanimity of different existing parties sharing some basic ideas regarding how to run the economy. And maybe you can explain a little bit how this dynamic presented in Brazil.
Well, this is a really complicated topic. I mean, even though we have a good number of parties with a lot of new alliances and rebrandings over the course of the last years, I think we are fitting this description of extreme center. These huge alliances, that we have now in Brazil, they have the effective control of the Congress. Even though PT, the Workers' Party, like the current government administration that we have, they identify themselves as center-left. What we get in practice, it's just the right wing pushing their agenda, using the Congress, the National Congress, as one of these mechanisms of doing that. So talking about PT, it's a little bit complicated to define what they are right now. They lack of political power and other reasons, of course. They are following a path that keeps going to the center instead of going to the left, so more center than left and extreme center again. So it is complex.
No, yes, I agree that it's a difficult issue. And maybe that's a little bit of the point I wanted to make when I asked you about Brazil, no? Because when we try to import these categories of European or US politics to Brazil or Argentina or Latin American countries, we find that they don't exactly match with our political structure. And hearing what you told me confirms this idea, because although obviously we can talk about neoliberalism as a global process, in fact, it has very different meanings in different countries. As you know, I am an internationalist through and through, but sometimes I think that geopolitics or global perspectives or world history or whatever have this tendency to abstract the difference, to eliminate the difference between countries. While for me, it should do the opposite. We should use internationalism as the art of studying the interactions between global and local levels.
Maybe because we could say there is a huge appeal for oversimplification. It's tempting and easier, as you just say, to abstract the differences and elaborate like standard definitions for situations that are not standard and not easy to explain, such as our Latin American one. I'm totally with you when it comes to analyze like the interaction between local and global. We don't live isolated from the rest of the world anymore. So it doesn't make sense to study our history, our Latin American history, and think about our future ignoring this fact. Well, I don't know how to put it, but This is for the listeners. Do you want a more concrete example of globalization than an Argentinian and a Brazilian in China talking about international relations and history? But okay, and I think this kind of brings us to our topics of today: semicolonialism, theory of dependence, and developmentalism. These topics, they have a strong connection to everything we've been discussing these past episodes, and in a sense, it underpins our whole perspective of what is the global south and what is one of the main contradictions in world politics right now.
Yes, and let me add that it is not such a coincidence that we're talking about this, since I wrote my master's thesis on the topic of semi-colonialism, and yours was on the topic of imperialism, no? So it is also something that's very close to our research experience, our interest in general. With that said, let's jump right into it.
We can start with semicolonialism then. Probably some of our listeners are familiar with the history of China and know that in the official history of the country, it is very common to describe the country between 1840 and 1949, or we could say between the first Opium War and the end of the War of the Liberation that the CPC won against the Kuomintang, as a semi-colonial, semi-feudal country. And both categories are very problematic in the sense that it is difficult to understand what this semi means. And I think your listeners at this point are aware that we do have some issues with terminologies, right?
Not only with that, we have many other issues, but yes. Leaving the idea of semi-feudalism aside for a while, to understand how the notion of semi-colonialism came to be, we have to transport ourselves to a happier time and place, the Communist International. Actually, not so happy, because the first congresses happened during the Civil War in the Soviet Union and the subsequent famine. But even in these difficult conditions, between 1919 and 1943, the communist parties from around the world, they got together in Soviet Russia regularly to discuss strategies and tactics.
Well, it's weird how in times of rupture, hard times like economic crisis, war, famine, the political debate between the left is so good, it's so fruitful. I don't want to start like this comparison between relationship between crises and huge transformations, huge changes, but for me this is really a thing. And yeah, like people, they traveled from all over the world to the Soviet Union to talk about revolution, like a journey that took months, was in many cases illegal. It's, I don't know, for me it's crazy to think that this was happening just 100 years ago.
Yeah, and I don't want to make it sound like the good old days, but the simple truth is that the communist left, or even the social democratic left, were at that time much better organized on an international level than now. And as a result, the production of theory was at a higher level too. Besides, I think that those years also had a greater connection between theory and praxis. So that's one of the reasons that we like to go back and study that time. Or at least for me, I don't know, the 20s are my jam.
The 20s? No, you know me. I'm more of a 90s guy. You know, Mariah, Celine. I like the real ones. Okay, I'm talking about real music. Okay, jokes aside. In this case, my things are the 40s. And, well, okay, let's get back on track, my friend. You're talking about the Communist International, right?
Oh, so now you are not only the war expert, you also are the bring me back on track expert. What would I do without you? Huh? I would be nothing. One of the key premises of the Comintern was that the advanced capitalist countries in Europe and the US should be dealt with different types of strategies compared to countries in Asia, Africa, or Latin America. Maybe for us now, this seems like it's really obvious after all the history that came afterwards. But at the time, in fact, the majority tendency in socialism, I mean social democracy, didn't think about those regions at all, or even in some cases defended colonialism. Still, even if the Comintern had a better attitude or had a better predisposition to thinking the situation of the global south and what to do compared to the Second International, this did not mean that they came to the topic ready to deploy policy. In the different congresses of the Comintern, the task was to create a policy, and that's what happened. And one of the first things that the communists noticed is that it was impossible to devise a general strategy for every country in the global south. Some countries, for example India, were pure colonial countries under the control of a foreign power. But other countries, like China, had in fact a more complex situation because some parts of the territory were under foreign control in the concessions, but the great majority was still free, at least in a formal sense.
Yeah, free to starve, right? But well, both India and China were oppressed by foreign imperialism, but the way in which communism, like they could organize in both countries, the type of political slogans they could raise, and even the type of alliances they could make, they were different. And not to mention that our Latin American reality was also different, and it is also different from these two cases too, which makes this task of, I don't know if I could say this, but with this word, but categorization a little bit more difficult. I don't know. What do you think?
I agree, and I would love to say that the distinction remained between colonialism and semi-colonialism, but in reality, many global South communists and Latin American communists in particular were very important in this process, made a push to create further distinctions between semi-colonial countries. Because going back to China as an example, it was a somewhat special case of semi-colonialism due to the unequal treaties and the foreign concessions. But Latin American countries, at least some of them, like Brazil, Argentina, or Peru, were formally politically independent and economically sovereign. The key word here is, of course, formally. They were not really politically independent, but in theory they were. And although this may seem like just a meaningless distinction, it is not so when we talk about political organization. This is one of the key insights of the Comintern, I think, that okay, if we think of this just from pure theory, we can say, oh, there's some semi-colonial countries like China, Brazil, Argentina. They are the same because they are semi-colonial. But if we think about how we should mobilize the people in those countries, the difference becomes very clear because when in Brazil or in Argentina, communists criticized imperialism, they were not talking about imperial control of their territory like in China.
Yeah, coming to think, there was not a May 4th movement in our countries, right? And let's say that we did have a lot of reasons to have one. Well, for you listeners that are not familiar with this part of the Chinese history, the May 4th was an anti-imperialist movement that was a direct answer to what happened after the Treaty of Versailles, the end of World War I. So, in other words, let me put it like this. Imagine that you joined the biggest war at the time in order to get back some of your territory. You send workers to dig trenches, and of course, you join the winning side. And after the war ends, your former allies decide to not return to you, your province, your territory, and instead they give it to your neighbor, a different country, which also invaded you later. So yes, I'm talking about Japan, okay? Just to make it clear. So it sounds crazy, but it's just modern Chinese history. The interesting thing about the May 4th movement is that it brought a lot of changes in both theory and practice. And it's totally important to mention that key leaderships in both the nationalism movement and the communists, they were in this movement at the time. Chairman Mao even saw that the movement was a part of the revolution. I don't know, this is something that is clear for us now.
Yes, I think it's a very good introduction, and it indicates the contrast between the Chinese situation and the Latin American situation. And I think these differences are one of the reasons why semicolonialism is such a good concept, because it allows us to understand that the general phenomenon of the interaction between imperialism and national circumstances, while also leaving space for local specificities. And I think that while it's very common to talk about communist ideology as dogmatic or rigid, in fact, at that time, it created this type of elastic concepts that allowed for productive interactions between the global and local levels. And as we will see in the next section, these ideas were not also influential in the communist sphere, but also in the nationalist ideologies of Latin America. When I was doing research for my thesis, one of the things that I noticed was that Latin American communists were very aware of the dilemmas of development that the region was facing. For example, we can talk a little bit about Mariátegui, who is a Peruvian Marxist who was one of the founders of the Socialist Party of Peru, which later became the Communist Party of Peru, and who was also one of the foundational intellectuals in Latin American Marxism. Some people say he was the best or the most important Latin American Marxist. I don't know if I would say that, but he definitely was an important pioneer. And he wrote a very famous book that's called Seven Essays on Peruvian Reality, in which he describes the economic and political development of Peru as a country that was pulled in different directions by class and racial conflict, and in which different economic systems coexisted.
Don't lie to me, my friend. I know you are in the Mariátegui fans club, okay? You're like holding the Mariátegui flag. But I don't know, this makes me think about that episode that we talked about how US imperialism could be like a pile of trash, a superposition of trash, different kinds of trash, old and new, all acting together.
That is a great parallel, especially because Mariátegui describes the structure of Peru as a superposition of imperialism. First, a Spanish imperialism that was based on colonization, slavery of the indigenous people, and a semi feudal mode of production. And later, a British imperialism which was based on extractive capitalism. So, the end result of this superpositional process was a deformed capitalist state in which the national bourgeoisie was unwilling to take the task of modernization and instead was complicit with imperialism in their extractive project, while also enforcing a racial hierarchy that allowed for the exploitation of the indigenous and black majorities.
Well, deformed capitalist state. This is a pretty good definition for a lot of countries and unfortunately for Latin America too. And I don't know, let's take the bourgeois perspective. It's so much easier to just be complicit with imperialism and get your big piece of cake in the end of the day while you can, right? I mean, no one wants to afford the risks, challenges, political costs, you name it, of developing a national project. For me, this can be seen, in some extent, of course, as individualism versus collectivism. Don't know, or maybe long versus short-run projects too. We leftists, we have this tendency to think more about the long-term consequences and how can we keep the boat going without leaving anyone behind. So this is different. And of course, everything I say, that this requires a lot of hard work and sacrifice, something that we know already the bourgeoisie is not willing to do.
Yes, this idea of the role of the bourgeoisie, I think it's one of the relevant differences between China and Peru or Latin America in general that Marxists like Mariátegui saw, because they ask themselves which should be the role that the bourgeoisie could play in the national project or in the national revolution. And this it's an old Marxist debate that goes back to Lenin and Roy, who was one of the founders of Indian communism, in which China and previously the Dutch Indies, what is now Indonesia, had been used as case studies of how an alliance between peasants, workers, intellectuals, and the national capitalists could work to develop the national revolution against imperialism. And this had different types of results. Even in China, this was totally not a straightforward process, with the Kuomintang playing different roles at different times. Like Codevila, one of the leaders of the Communist Party of Argentina, said, the bourgeoisie was treacherous everywhere. But for Mariátegui, one difference between the situation in China, in which it made sense in some situations to make an alliance with the bourgeoisie, in Latin America, the national bourgeoisie could never play a progressive role. Because due to the deformed development of capitalism in the region, their interests were in fact aligned with imperialism at all times.
Well, I am totally sided with Mariátegui in this one. And I don't know, my friend, since you mentioned the Kuomintang, let's remember too that many of them switched sides to support the Japanese imperialism when they had their chance. So how can you trust, the bourgeoisie? I don't see how people that only see value in bigger profits can really contribute to development. And well, talking about development, I think it's time for us to jump into the next session and start discussing about other ways of understanding the economic, political structure of Latin America.
Well, after semicolonialism, we can move forward in time to dependency theory, developmentalism, and the contributions of Latin American theories to the topic. Since Brazil is one of the main centers of these ideas, I think you should start, Comrade Pedro.
I think it's better to start with developmentalism, since in a certain way we could say that dependency theory is kind of an upgrade to it. But anyways, definitions first. Developmentalism or national developmentalism is a political economic doctrine that advocates for a stronger participation of the state in guiding the economic affairs of the nation. I know this is very textbook-like. If you want an analogy, you could think of this school of thought as an opposite of anarcho-capitalism.
Oh, it's an opposition that makes some sense because extreme forms of economic liberalism have been opposing state building or modernization projects since the 20s or the 30s at least. Then in the 70s, we had the neoliberal tragedy of Thatcher and company. And now we have the farce version, no? 14-year-old with yellow flags that have never seen a shower before.
Oh, no, please, let's not talk about these snakes, fans of big boots. I'm in a good mood today, okay? And I agree with you. Somehow we still end in this battle between more state and less state. But going back to the theory, I think it would be too much to explain its origins, because they trace back to mercantilism. So it's a long history. But the Brazilian version of national developmentalism, it was shaped by two main figures, Hamilton and Liszt. So in one side, a founding father of the United States, and a German political scientist that was crazy about trains. But yes, and jokes aside, I kind of like Friedrich List, and his passion about trains was totally justified since he was one of the key figures in transforming Germany and United States too, if we talk about ideological theoretical contribution during the 19th century. Then, okay, going a little bit in time, after that nightmare, that global crisis in 1929, the national developmentalism made a comeback, and that's when Brazil gets in. During Vargas' first tenure, like from 1930 to 1945, there was a series of developments, not only in the economic field, but also in terms of establishing bureaucracies and institutions that are still present in modern-day Brazil. Vargas, he was a super controversial figure. He was a dictator. But it's impossible to talk about the first steps of Brazilian national economy without giving him the credit he deserves. At least that's how I see it.
And there are some interesting parallels between Vargas and other nationalist governments of Latin America at the time. It's not that it was a unique phenomenon, but we see some similar things going on everywhere. For example, since we were already on the topic of Peru, we can mention Leguía, who he governed for 11 years, if I remember correctly, and he contributed to the partial modernization of Peru. And a later example would be Perón in Argentina. And this is a little bit ironic, but in Argentina, some people call Vargas the Brazil's Perón, but in fact, it should be the other way around, no? Because Vargas was in power before. And both Perón and Vargas, I think, will later be made into archetypes of Latin American populism. Although, for me at least, it would be more proper to speak of them as nationalists.
Yeah, they are really nationalists, right? And you see, like in Brazil, we don't call Perón as Argentinian Vargas. But yeah, a lot of people, especially the media, they love making this association. Like saying that Vargas, Perón, they created our version, like the Latin American version of populism, etc. Which is something that I have mixed feelings about. Because, well, we discussed this already, right? Populism and being popular are different things. But, okay, getting back on track, national developmentalism of this period gave Brazil a lot of progress in terms of industrial and economic power. Like during his presidency, Brazil got big companies like Vale, one of the largest mining companies in the world, and Petrobras during his second term after the Second World War. But like all economic theories, we could say, nothing is perfect. The developmentalism started to lose its power around the 60s. And I think also it's a good time to mention CEPAL or ECLEC. I'm sorry, I need to mention again how ugly these terms they sound in English. I never read them in English like this.
I have to say that for me too, it's the first time I heard about ECLAC, and I don't know, I will have to present a motion to ban this term from every conversation. Clearly, it's CEPAL. That's the correct name. Now, I think that we are making like a very loose genealogical history here, and maybe if we order it a little bit, we could say that first, socialism and communism made the first steps in creating a model to explain the economic structure of Latin America. And later, Vargas, Perón, and other nationalist governments tried to implement a substitution of import economic model that would industrialize and modernize our countries. By the 60s, this was showing some signs of exhaustion. And at that time, institutions like CEPAL took many of the early insights of Marxism as a way to explain what was failing, and also as a way to understand the way forward.
Yeah, I agree with both things. And this is something that I believe we mentioned already. I don't know, maybe I'm confusing our episodes with our conversations. But economics are mainly about trial and error, right? There is no perfect theory that can be applied to all nations and scenarios. And I don't know about you, I kind of enjoy this exercise of going back in time, going back to the past, to see where the things started, like reading Tadu or Prebisch, all these people that somehow contributed to our overall knowledge. And I see dependency theory like it somehow proves this point, because it still is an attempt to see the flaws, the failures you mentioned, and propose improvements to developmentalism. If the developmentalists they saw underdevelopment and development as an evolutive process, like stages in a timeline, guys like Marini, Singer, and even one of the Brazilian former presidents, Fernando Henrique Cardoso, he saw the two things, underdevelopment and development, as two distinct realities. No need to say this was quite a Marxist view of Latin America developmental process, right? And Rui Mauro Marini, he saw in Marx a source of insight to propose the changes to the Cepalist thinking at the time.
There's for sure a clear Marxist inspiration going on. And I think it can be connected to the phenomenon of the new left, which was in vogue at the time too. So new left is other of these vague concepts that's used basically to talk about the left after the 60s. And there's one European and US new left, and then a Latin American new left that they share some connections, but they are not exactly the same. In Latin America, the new left came after the Cuban Revolution and was also inspired by the Vietnam War and the Cultural Revolution in China. And these events created an opening for the expansion of new types of Marxism, and especially of new types of national left movements that didn't follow the standard Soviet model. Also, as a personal aside, I think that one problem I usually have with the new left is that it damages a lot our understanding of the history of the left before it, because it was very critical of the past and sometimes too much. But as a movement, it was very effective in popularizing certain Marxist ideas, and that gave way to institutions like the CEPAL. However, on the topic of their political struggle, they were ultimately unsuccessful, since the military dictatorships defeated all these emancipatory projects, although, of course, with different levels of success and with different economic ideologies.
I don't know, this thing of new left, like you just said, it kind of makes me a bit sad because, well, the PT, the Workers' Party in Brazil, is also a product of this leftist nouvelle vague of the 80s, the end of the military rule. For me and a lot of people who dedicate some time to think about Brazil and Latin America, it is quite clear what are the limits of this rereading of Marx. In your case, in the Brazilian case, you will end up like tied by alliances that are not so strategic and getting further and further away from your original goal. Well, talking about the Workers' Party, talking about PT, I think we should go back to developmentalism. Since two of its main variants, they were born under PT's administration: new developmentalism and social developmentalism. This new developmentalism, they argued for a national development strategy that is, amongst many things, based in domestic savings rather than foreign ones, and industrialization through export of manufactured goods instead of substitution of import. So they saw that this model of substitution of imports was it belongs to the past, right? And on the other hand, we have the social developmentalism. They are more focused on transform the economy by a wage-led model that it's boosted by growing public spending. So opposing private spending, they are kind of opposite to private investment and focus on growing public spending. And I don't know, I'm even getting a little bit confused because I had a fierce battle with economic jargon while reading for this episode. But I think it's important to, I need to mention that there is a lot of criticism surrounding the social developmentalism, since it's one of the political, economical pillars of the PT right now.
Don't worry, my friend. I think you are pretty clear. And one important takeaway from this debate between the new and the social versions of developmentalism is that it's a great example of how the topic of development itself changed in the history of semi-colonial countries. Because in the case of the communists we saw in the first section, since they denied that the national bourgeoisie could play a progressive role, the only way forward for them was a communist revolution that would, under the control of the workers and peasants, create the conditions for a real modernization of our countries. It's a very typical slogan of the time, would be like the communist revolution would execute the national revolution or the tasks of the national revolution. On the other hand, the theories of development in the 60s, and I think the PT is a good example of how these theories developed, accepted a part of the Marxist critique. They agree in the existence of a world system that was organized hierarchically according to a division of labor. But there was a certain retreat from class, as Marxists would say, because they thought that this issue could be solved in an alliance with at least some parts of the national bourgeoisie.
And that's the thing, right? These alliances can destroy you. And I just want to add one thing. I mentioned that social developmentalism, like it's one of the main economic branches, like theory of the PT, of the Workers' Party. Maybe what I said could be applied for, I don't know, until Dilma's administration, before the coup. I don't think this applies for now, like for the reality of the Brazilian economic reality right now. And I don't know, I think I should go back to my international relations roots to finish my point. Because, well, talking about the new and social developmentalism, they have a huge difference too between private sector, national economy. I spoke about that, but I want to stress, because the new developmentalists, they really believe that they can control the private sector and direct the investment. They kind of relates to this alliance we were talking about. While the social developmentalism, they advocate for a more industrial policy and state-owned enterprises. Well, after all we spoke, like so far in this episode, it's a bit needless to say that the economic model you choose to follow, it's, I don't know, deeply connected to your reality, your history, and of course your position in the geopolitical arena. We, Global South members, we are in constant search for what is better for us vis-a-vis what is better for them. So maybe we could say that our history is shaped by this huge battle. What do you think?
We all know that you just want it to be a battle so you can have some 4.7 or whatever generation planes flying around. No need to lie. But I think that in this episode, at least, we could make clear that the relationship between concepts like semicolonialism and developmentalism exist, and sometimes this is obscure in our history. And as you say, there is a certain tension between the way in which global capitalism has been organized and the desires of people in our countries to change that system by using the tools of modernization and development. However, one thing that has been lost more and more is the discussion of the class system that supports and allows for this structure to exist and reproduce. And I think that is one of the reasons of why these projects failed in Latin America in comparison with, I don't know, China. Because if you are not conscious of the class system that you are working with, then collaboration with capitalists that are not really interested in their own nation can only end up in disappointment.
Yeah, totally. I just need to say that I know you said 4.7 generation just because it doesn't exist, right? You want to make me angry. And yeah, like talking about disappointment, I think we should talk one day, we should have an episode about what can we do. Because there's a lot of things within our reach. We need to keep our hopes up. And I don't know about the listeners, but we spoke about this already. This feeling of tiredness when we open the newspaper, like we scroll through social media and see all this kind of crazy news every time, every week. But this is not something that we can do today, because I guess we are running out of time. So let's finish this topic for now, and we will be back in a couple of weeks with more analysis and theorizing about what's going on with the world. Of course, don't forget to like, comment, subscribe. You know the drill already, right? We cannot do this without your support. So that's it. 再见.
再见.